personal data debate. There are even attempts to protect them and their rights in the paper. But fundamentally, the paper does not address these concerns in such a way that harm to the citizens of India will be avoided. On the contrary. The reason for this is that the report is based on a number of false assumptions. And part of these is a failure to recognize the dynamics of what Shoshana Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism. Whether it's driven by private entities or by the state, surveillance capitalism refers to the unbridled datafication of even the most intimate aspects of our lives, and the fact that our entire lives are basically being reconfigured to fit into the datafication model. Increasingly, this dynamic has been criticized for the tremendously negative impact it has on people. In particular, what is criticized is that our governments and private companies are not only using this data to understand our behavior, but also to actually steer it. And so increasingly, as persons and our bodies, what we become are instruments for the purpose of others rather than a means in our own right, an end in our own right. At the Internet Democracy Project, we have argued that central to this debate is the description of data as a resource, because it disconnects data from our persons and our bodies, as the report does as well. In practice, this is not how data is experienced, nor how it is approached actually by those who drive these drives to collect data. If you look, for example, at quarantine apps in the context of COVID-19, you will see that these use GPS data, not to control the data, but to control the body of the person who's being watched. And those who are watched also experience it in that way. So the point I'm trying to make here is that whether directly or indirectly relevant to us as people, data is not just a resource, it is also in some way embodied. And to develop policies that will actually protect the rights of people going forward fundamentally, this needs to be taken into account. Now, the paper fails to do this in a number of ways. First of all, it never questions data collection as such, right? It talks about data as a resource consistently, and it also portrays that resource as central to the betterment of circumstances in the nation. While doing that, it constantly allies economic value and social and public value as well. But a deeper understanding of the dynamics of surveillance capitalism that I just described would actually question whether the deep datafication of our lives that we are experiencing right now is of social and public value in the first place, right? After all, that entails a commodification of even the most intimate aspects of our lives, so much so that some have described it as neoliberalism everywhere. I am not trying to say here that there won't be social and public value to data, but the dynamics of surveillance capitalism work as on a whole against social and public interests. That's my point, not in favor of them, including because surveillance capitalism and datafication actually privileges particular forms of knowledge over others as the space to be outside of datafication shrinks. This cost of datafication for social and public interest is not acknowledged, let alone addressed in the paper. The second issue I wanted to talk about was, and this is related, the description of the category of non-personal data in the paper as a resource that actually encompasses a wide range of data. So it covers anonymized data about our health. Sorry, that's a plane. Anonymized data about our health, over the health of agricultural crops on a farmer's field, to weather data. This is common around the world to group all these different categories. But it's nevertheless problematic because it doesn't allow us to recognize the distinctive harms that can come to people. Those are being underplayed. There are two places in the paper where it actually recognizes that the relation to from data to persons is not merely as a resource. and that it actually has a deeper relevance as well. And yet again, it fails to really effectively address the problem there. The first one is when it proposes that consent is sought for anonymized data as well. That's laudable, but it will only really have value again if the current dynamics of surveillance capitalism are questioned as well. As the forthcoming paper by my colleague Tripti Jain and myself explains, if we have been arguing that consent mechanisms are actually failing to do all of the work that we expect from them when it comes to datafication, if so many of us actually have no idea what we consented to exactly, even if the people on this particular webinar might even have read the terms and conditions, that's because the consent mechanisms at the moment are not intended to put us in control. Instead, they are intended to legitimize the transfer of control over our data, and thus increasingly the control we have over our bodies, its actions, and its lives to others, be it government or companies. This is what I meant with we become an instrument. And to give you just one example to make this real, third-party data sharing, for example, is one such mechanism. As long as these larger mechanisms aren't questioned again, asking consent to share anonymized data just becomes another clause in the adhesion contracts that we are asked to sign that ultimately work against and not in favor of people's autonomy and self-determination. Really, such a proposal to ask for anonymized consent would only work on a case-by-case basis. The second area where the paper recognizes that the relation of data to our persons cannot be adequately described as a resource is when it discusses the notion of collective privacy, and I was really delighted to see it emerge in paper. But once again, if the intent is to empower communities, this is not done effectively, because at the most fundamental level, we should ask whether such data should be collected so widely in the first place. Will it include also data that is being derived? Why should communities only have recourse after the fact rather than also control beforehand in terms of what is collected? So when developing a regulatory framework for non-personal data, it just becomes increasingly clear that where non-personal data is about people, a different set of questions arises would also require a separate framework. It is a mistake to make a distinction only between personally identifiable data and anonymized data when we think about harms for people. What we should instead look at is data that relates to people and other data and build frameworks around that. And then the third point I wanted to discuss and link to the notion of collective privacy is the concept of community data as it is put forward in that paper. A community is defined, and I'm reading, any group of people that are bound by common interests or purposes and involved in social and or economic behavior.
Hi, I think Anya's had a connectivity issue. So I think we'll just pause here and just check with her about her connectivity and whether she can log back in. So let's please hold on for a few minutes.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, Anja, now. Welcome back.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I had to switch to my phone. I'm very sorry about this. My internet connection has not been reliable. Yes, I was talking about the public interest. So I think by aligning the public and the interest and community interest, as is being done here, we make a mistake. The Uber users as a community should not be the starting point of the debate. Second, if you look at the field of development, for example, community development became a very powerful stream for a very specific reason. It was in recognition of the fact that trickle-down versions of development often fail to reach the most marginalized. And community development was then an attempt to ensure that they too were included. But it soon became clear that community development too was no panacea, because as feminists pointed out, within communities too there are power relations. And unless these are addressed in creative and proactive ways, the most marginalized within marginalized communities will continue to be left out. So what community approaches really squarely put on the table is power relations. And the paper again fails to address these completely. In fact, in many cases, it seems that it thinks it's relevant to have a government body to be the trustee for a community's data, which actually in practice transfers only more power to the state rather than to the community, as well as depoliticizing the concept and eventually, right? So if we're going to empower communities with their data, we really need to start from their interests and allow them to be centrally involved in any policy around their data, including on decisions on whether certain data about their community can be collected in the first place. And that would require much stronger participatory structures. So while there are many more things to say about the shortcomings of the paper, what I really wanted to do was point out some of these fundamental framing challenges with the proposals that are there, specifically when it comes to questions of what this means for people. If we want this empowering approach to become a reality for all citizens, then we really need to start thinking much more creatively. Thank you.
Thanks,